Night falls over the Tower of London. Its stone walls rise cold and silent against the dark sky, unchanged by centuries of secrets. This fortress has seen coronations and executions, triumph and terror. But among all its mysteries, none is more haunting than that of two vanished boys. In the summer of 1483, England's crown rested on the head of a child. Edward V, only 12 years old, was king in name, but never crowned. Alongside his younger brother, he was brought here, to the Tower, supposedly for safety. They were princes of England, heirs of a victorious dynasty. Then, suddenly, they were gone. No public execution, no grave, no farewell. Only rumors, whispered in taverns, spread through the streets of London, and later written into history by victors and playwrights. At the center of those whispers stands one man, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, uncle, protector, king. Was Richard III a loyal guardian who became a victim of propaganda, or did he order the murder of his own nephews to seize the throne? 5 centuries later, the evidence is fragmented, the truth obscured by politics, fear, and time. Tonight, we return to the Tower, not to find certainty, but to confront one of history's darkest questions. Was King Edward V murdered by Richard III? England in 1483 was a kingdom exhausted by conflict. For nearly 30 years, the Wars of the Roses had torn the country apart, family against family, crown against crown. Though the fighting had quieted, peace was fragile, resting not on unity, but on uneasy compromise. Beneath the surface, old rivalries still burned. The House of York sat on the throne, victorious at last. King Edward IV had ruled with confidence and charm, but his power depended on a delicate balance between noble factions. Loyalty was rarely unconditional. Alliances shifted quickly, and ambition often outweighed honor. In this world, survival depended on proximity to power and on removing rivals before they could strike first. At court, tension simmered between two groups. On one side stood the Woodvilles, the Queen's family, raised rapidly to influence through Edward IV's marriage. They were seen by many nobles as outsiders, too powerful, too ambitious, and dangerously close to the young heir. On the other side were the old Yorkist loyalists, hardened by years of war, suspicious of the Woodvilles' sudden rise. The death of Edward IV shattered this fragile equilibrium. His heir, Edward V, was a child, untried, inexperienced, and surrounded by men eager to rule in his name. A minority government was inherently dangerous. Whoever controlled the king would control England. Outside London, the scars of civil war remained fresh. Nobles maintained private armies. Executions were remembered, not forgiven. Trust was scarce, and fear was a political tool. Rumors spread faster than royal proclamations, and whispers of betrayal could ignite rebellion. This was not an age of innocence. It was an age where preemptive strikes were considered prudence, and where eliminating rivals was often justified as preserving stability. Into this atmosphere of suspicion, ambition, and unresolved violence stepped a boy king and his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. England stood at a crossroads, and in moments like these, history is often decided not by justice, but who acts first. In April 1483, England awoke to shocking news. King Edward IV was dead. Only 40 years old, strong in body and victorious in war, Edward had seemed invincible. His sudden death stunned the court and the country alike. Officially, the cause was illness, perhaps pneumonia, perhaps complications from years of hard living, but the speed of his decline fueled unease. A powerful king had vanished almost overnight. Edward IV had been more than a warrior. He was the keystone holding England's fragile peace together. His personal authority restrained rival nobles, balanced competing factions, and kept the lingering chaos of civil war at bay. With him gone, that restraint vanished too. The throne passed immediately to his eldest son, Edward V, a boy of just 12 years. The king died at Westminster, far from his heir, who was staying at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border. That distance mattered. In medieval politics, proximity was power. Whoever reached the young king first could shape the future of the realm. Edward IV left behind unresolved tensions. His marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had elevated her family to unprecedented heights, breeding resentment among older noble houses. Though Edward trusted his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, he also relied heavily on the Woodvilles to protect his children. His final wishes, if clearly stated at all, would soon be disputed. The moment Edward IV's body was laid to rest, England entered a dangerous limbo. A child king, a divided nobility, and a crown worth killing for created a perfect storm. Courtiers began choosing sides before the king was even buried. Letters were sent, armies quietly gathered, and plans hastily revised. Edward IV's death was not merely the passing of a monarch, it was the removal of the last barrier between order and ambition. From this moment forward, every decision would be shadowed by fear. And for Edward V, the loss of his father marked the beginning of a journey that would lead not to a coronation, but toward the Tower of London. Edward V became king at the age of 12, an age when most boys were still learning obedience, not commanding a kingdom. His accession was lawful and undisputed in theory, yet deeply vulnerable in practice. Medieval England had little faith in child rulers. A boy king meant regents, guardians, and protectors, and those roles invited ambition as surely as the crown itself. Edward had been raised carefully for rule. Educated at Ludlow Castle, he was intelligent, courteous, and well aware of his royal duties. Contemporary accounts describe him as serious beyond his years, eager to please, and conscious of the expectations placed upon him. But education could not replace experience, and experience was exactly what Edward lacked. Power, therefore, rested not with the boy king, but with those around him. His mother, Elizabeth Woodville, sought to protect her son through her powerful family network. The Woodvilles believed that keeping Edward close was essential to their survival and to their influence. Many nobles, however, saw this as a dangerous monopoly on royal authority. Edward's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector, a role intended to govern in the king's name until his coronation. Richard was no inexperienced courtier. He was a seasoned commander, loyal to his brother during years of brutal civil war. To some, he represented stability. To others, he was a threat. As Edward V was proclaimed king, the ceremony was hollow, without a crown upon his head. His coronation was scheduled, but until that moment, his authority remained incomplete. In this fragile interval, decisions made in private chambers mattered more than proclamations made in public. The young king stood at the center of competing interests, yet had little control over them. He was king, but not yet ruler, protected, yet powerless, celebrated, yet already endangered. History would remember Edward V not for what he did, but for what was done around him, and ultimately for what was done to him. In the dangerous world of medieval politics,
Being a child king was not a blessing, it was a liability. The Woodville family stood at the heart of England's growing tension. Once minor nobles, their fortunes changed dramatically when Elizabeth Woodville married King Edward IV in secret. Almost overnight, her relatives were elevated to titles, wealth, and influence, reshaping the balance of power at court. To the Woodvilles, this rise was survival. To their enemies, it was an unforgivable intrusion. Elizabeth Woodville was fiercely protective of her children, especially her eldest son, Edward V. She understood the dangers of a child king and believed that only her family could be trusted to safeguard his future. Her brothers, uncles, and sons-in-law surrounded the young king, serving as advisors, escorts, and guardians. Their closeness to royal authority was deliberate and deeply resented. Many long-established nobles viewed the Woodvilles as opportunists who had advanced too far too fast. They lacked the ancient bloodlines of England's great houses, yet wielded power equal to them. Worse still, they controlled access to the young king. In a court defined by suspicion, this dominance bred fear and hostility. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, shared this mistrust. Though loyal to his brother Edward IV, Richard had little patience for the Woodvilles' influence. He believed, perhaps sincerely, that their grip on Edward V threatened the stability of the realm. To him and his allies, removing the Woodvilles from power was not treason, but necessity. When Edward IV died, the Woodvilles acted swiftly. They arranged for Edward V to travel to London under their supervision, hoping to secure the coronation before rivals could intervene. It was a race against time and against Richard himself. The struggle was no longer merely about protecting a boy king. It was about who would rule in his name. The Woodvilles' rise had made them powerful, but power in medieval England was fragile. Their influence would soon provoke a confrontation that changed history forever and placed the fate of two princes in terrible danger. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was not an obvious villain, at least not to those who knew him in life. He was the youngest brother of King Edward IV, forged by war from an early age. While others maneuvered at court, Richard spent years on the battlefield during the Wars of the Roses, fighting relentlessly for the Yorkist cause. Loyalty, discipline, and military competence defined his reputation. By 1483, Richard was one of the most powerful men in England. He governed the north with firm but effective rule, earning respect from local nobles and commoners alike. Records suggest he was an able administrator, concerned with justice and order. To many contemporaries, Richard appeared dependable, a man who had never betrayed his brother and had everything to lose by destabilizing the realm. Yet Richard was also pragmatic, hardened by decades of bloodshed. He understood how quickly power could shift and how mercy could become weakness. In his world, hesitation was dangerous, trust was conditional, survival required decisive action. Edward IV had named Richard Lord Protector of the realm, entrusting him with the governance of England until Edward V's coronation. On paper, this was a position of guardianship, not ambition. Richard swore to defend his nephew's rights and preserve the kingdom's stability. But words carried little weight in a political climate poisoned by suspicion. Richard viewed the Woodvilles with deep mistrust. He believed they sought to dominate the young king and exclude him from authority. Whether this fear was justified or exaggerated remains debated, but it shaped his actions profoundly. To Richard, removing the Woodvilles was an act of preservation, not betrayal. Still, question lingers. Did Richard intend only to protect the crown for his nephew, or did the crown itself begin to tempt him once it lay within reach?
History would later paint Richard as a monster, twisted in body and soul. But before the princes vanished, he was neither tyrant nor king. He was a soldier, a protector, and a man standing at the edge of a decision that would define his legacy forever. In late April 1483, the young King Edward V began his journey from Ludlow Castle toward London. It should have been a triumphant procession, an anointed king traveling to claim his crown. Instead, it unfolded like a quiet march into uncertainty. Edward rode at the center of a small but powerful escort, surrounded by his mother's relatives, the Woodvilles, who intended to deliver him safely to his coronation. The road to London was more than a physical route, it was a political race. Whoever controlled the king during this journey would shape the future of England. Every mile brought new dangers, not from bandits or rebels, but from allies who might become rivals. Messages traveled faster than horses, and plans were already shifting before Edward reached his destination. Edward himself appeared calm and composed. Contemporary accounts suggest he was confident in his royal status and unaware of the forces gathering around him. To the boy king, this was a duty, another step toward becoming the ruler his father had prepared him to be. But to the men escorting him, this journey was about power, survival, and timing. Unbeknownst to Edward, his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was already moving south with armed supporters. Appointed Lord Protector, Richard claimed he was traveling to greet his nephew and ensure a peaceful transition of power. Whether his intentions were defensive or calculated remains fiercely debated. The atmosphere grew tense as the two groups drew closer. Trust was thin, and rumors filled the silence. Some whispered that the Woodvilles planned to rule through the boy king. Others warned that Richard intended to seize control before the coronation could take place. When Edward's party reached Stony Stratford, the journey paused, but history did not. What was meant to be a brief stop on the road to kingship would instead become a turning point. By the time Edward mounted his horse again, the path to the throne had already begun to close behind him.
The town of Stony Stratford would become a pivotal moment in English history, though at the time it seemed nothing more than a routine stop on a journey. Edward V, accompanied by his younger brother Richard and the Woodville entourage, arrived expecting a brief pause, a chance to rest before continuing to London. Instead, they were met with a calculated intervention that would change the course of the realm. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been moving quickly to assert control. Accompanied by armed men loyal to him, he intercepted the young king's party under the guise of protection. The Woodvilles, unaware of Richard's precise intentions, were caught off guard. Guards loyal to Richard swiftly detained several of Edward's mother's relatives, including key figures who managed the king's household and personal security. Their arrest sent a clear message: Richard now controlled access to the heir of England. Edward V, though still only 12, was acutely aware of the tension. His journey to the crown had turned into a trap. Surrounded by unfamiliar faces and uncertain of who could be trusted, the boy king found himself under the watchful eye of the very man sworn to protect him. Yet outwardly he remained composed, perhaps too young to understand the full scope of the danger. This arrest was more than a simple political maneuver. It was the first decisive step in Richard's consolidation of power. By neutralizing the Woodvilles, he removed the immediate influence of Edward's maternal family, leaving the king isolated. London, and indeed all of England, would soon witness the consequences of this carefully orchestrated act. The balance of power had shifted dramatically in a single afternoon at a quiet market town. History would later view Stony Stratford as the moment when a protector began to eclipse a king, setting the stage for one of England's greatest mysteries,
the disappearance of the princes in the Tower. The Tower of London, a fortress of stone and history, had long served as both royal residence and prison. For centuries, kings and queens had walked its halls, and the whispers of intrigue clung to every wall. On the day Edward V arrived, it was meant to be a sanctuary, a place of safety before his coronation. Yet the tower's imposing gates also marked the boundary between protection and imprisonment. Edward, just 12 years old, rode into the courtyard with his younger brother Richard by his side. The atmosphere was tense. Courtiers and guards observed closely, ensuring the procession followed Richard, Duke of Gloucester's orders. The boy king, accustomed to the gentle guidance of his mother and the Woodvilles, now faced a fortress under the control of his uncle. The air was thick with expectation and unease. Richard had arranged every detail with precision. By controlling the tower, he effectively controlled the air. The Woodvilles, whose influence had protected Edward during his journey, were barred from accompanying him beyond the gates. Friends and relatives who had guided him safely thus far were now separated, leaving the young king vulnerable to the ambitions surrounding him. Inside, the tower's walls seemed to close in. Ancient stone corridors, shadowed chambers, and the occasional flicker of torchlight created an environment of both reverence and dread. Guards loyal to Richard oversaw the boys, while whispers of loyalty, fear, and rumor circulated among the staff. Every step the princes took echoed in history, marking the threshold between childhood and the perilous politics of kingship. The entry into the tower was meant to be temporary, a pause before Edward V could ascend the throne. Instead, it became the stage for one of history's greatest mysteries. Within these walls, the line between safety and danger blurred, and the fate of England's young kings began to hang in the balance. Would the tower protect the princes or conceal them forever? The Tower of London was no ordinary fortress. By 1483, it had already earned a fearsome reputation as a place where fortunes and lives could vanish overnight. To the public, it symbolized royal authority, justice, and protection. To those within its walls, it could be a prison, a trap, or a tomb. Its high stone walls, iron gates, and shadowed corridors held secrets that had unnerved generations of nobles, soldiers, and even kings. For centuries, the tower had witnessed both triumph and tragedy. Kings and queens had used it as a residence, yet its history was marked by imprisonment, betrayal, and death. Notable figures, some innocent, some guilty, had disappeared behind its walls. The Earl of Warwick, Lady Jane Grey, and others had faced confinement, interrogation, and execution within its fortified chambers. Tales of sudden arrests, mysterious deaths, and shadowed executions were whispered in London streets. Its architecture reinforced its reputation. Tower Green, a secluded courtyard, provided privacy for executions. The White Tower, its central keep, was designed as both a royal palace and a place of containment. The narrow staircases and hidden rooms allowed for control and secrecy. Guards patrolled diligently, their loyalty a matter of life and death. Anyone inside was subject to the tower's strict hierarchy, where power was absolute and mercy scarce. By the time Edward V and his younger brother arrived, the tower was already a place that inspired dread. Though officially they were there for protection before the coronation, its history cast a long shadow. To Londoners, the tower was a reminder that even princes were not immune to danger. Every stone seemed to echo with rumors of lost heirs, executed traitors, and vanished nobles. The tower's dark reputation was not merely superstition, it was lived experience. For the young princes,
Entering the tower marked the beginning of a chapter steeped in mystery, fear, and a peril that history would never fully illuminate. Would it safeguard them or hide them forever? The arrival of Prince Richard, the younger brother of Edward V, marked a significant moment in the unfolding drama of the Tower. Barely 9 years old, Richard of Shrewsbury was brought to the fortress to join his elder brother. To the outside world, it seemed a simple family reunion, a boy joining his brother before the coronation. Yet in the shadows of the tower, the arrival of the younger prince shifted the balance of power and deepened the stakes of what was already a tense situation. The young prince, escorted by his mother's retainers, entered the tower with innocence and expectation. He was unaware of the political currents swirling around him, the whispered suspicions, and the ambitions that would soon decide his fate. To Edward V, the presence of his brother should have been a source of comfort, a familiar face in an otherwise unsettling environment. But the tower was not a safe home. It was a place where appearances could deceive, and loyalty could be bought or coerced. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, controlled the tower and orchestrated every aspect of the prince's stay. By ensuring that the younger brother was also confined within the fortress, he effectively consolidated control over the royal heirs. The boys, once under the protection of their mother and the Woodvilles, were now isolated and dependent entirely on their uncle. Guards watched their movements, and even minor decisions, where they slept, what they ate, who they saw, were carefully managed. For the public, the prince's presence in the tower was normal, part of the preparations for Edward V's coronation. For history, however, it became a moment fraught with uncertainty. The arrival of Richard Rise intensified the sense of foreboding. 2 boys, heirs to the throne, were now behind walls known for imprisonment and death, leaving the kingdom to speculate, fear, and later mourn. The tower had taken them in, but whether it would protect or betray them remained a question that history would never fully answer. For the briefest moment, Edward V and his younger brother Richard were together in the Tower of London, 2 innocent boys at the center of a deadly political storm. It was the last time the world would see them alive, a fleeting chapter before their disappearance became one of history's most enduring mysteries. The princes were confined within the tower, their movements carefully controlled by guards loyal to Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Yet despite the formality of their surroundings, the boys shared a bond that only siblings could understand. They played quietly in the courtyards, whispered to each other in chambers, and found comfort in the familiarity of one another's presence. In a fortress built for authority and imprisonment, their innocence briefly humanized the stone walls. Outside, tension mounted. Londoners whispered about the absence of coronation preparations and the sudden control Richard had asserted over the young king. Rumors spread, creating a climate of fear and suspicion. Within the tower, the princes remained largely unseen, their daily lives overshadowed by political maneuvers they could not comprehend. The isolation intensified their vulnerability, even as their presence together offered a fragile sense of security. Contemporary accounts and later historians suggest the boys may have been aware, at least in part, that danger loomed. Edward V, older and more aware of court politics, likely understood that his position as king was precarious. Richard, the younger, would have trusted in his brother for guidance and protection. Their time together, however short, represented both the height of their childhood and the edge of tragedy. The image of the 2 princes, brothers, heirs to the throne,
and at the mercy of the Tower has endured for centuries. It is a haunting reminder of innocence caught in the machinery of power, and of a moment before history would close the door on their lives. Within these walls, childhood ended, and one of England's greatest mysteries quietly began.
The coronation of Edward V, a moment that should have been the crowning glory of a child king, never took place. Originally scheduled shortly after his arrival in London, the ceremony was delayed and then delayed again, shrouding the young monarch's reign in uncertainty from its very beginning. In medieval England, the coronation was more than pageantry. It was the legal and spiritual moment that solidified a king's authority. Without it, Edward's position was tenuous, dependent entirely on those around him. The delays fueled suspicion across the kingdom. Courtiers whispered about political maneuvering, while citizens debated what the postponement meant. Some believed the Woodvilles were to blame, accused of trying to consolidate power around the boy king. Others suspected Richard, Duke of Gloucester, whose influence was growing steadily. The longer the coronation was postponed, the more precarious Edward's situation became, and the more isolated he felt within the Tower's walls. Richard, officially Lord Protector, claimed the delay was necessary to ensure stability and proper preparation. He argued that the boy king's youth required careful oversight and that ceremonies must be conducted with the proper solemnity. Yet every postponement shifted power toward Richard and away from Edward's maternal family, effectively undermining the young king's independence before he could rule. The Tower itself, once a symbol of protection, now seemed a gilded cage. Every day without a coronation was another day the princes were exposed to political plotting. Plans for Edward's official assumption of the throne, with its public acclaim and ritual legitimacy, remained indefinitely suspended. The delayed coronation became a turning point. What was intended as a pause to honor tradition instead became a tool of manipulation, isolating Edward and giving Richard the opportunity to reshape the kingdom's future. In the eyes of history, the postponed ceremony marked not just a missing coronation, it marked the beginning of the end for England's young king. As days stretched into weeks, the absence of Edward V's coronation and the prince's seclusion within the Tower sparked a wave of whispers across London. Rumors spread like wildfire, carried on the streets, in taverns, and through the corridors of the royal court. People speculated about the young king's health, his mother's influence, and the intentions of Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Every delay, every guarded action became fodder for gossip. Some said the Woodvilles were plotting to rule through Edward, using him as a puppet to consolidate their influence. Others claimed Richard sought to control or even remove the boy entirely. Merchants, servants, and nobles alike debated what they had heard, embellishing details with each retelling. The city, already wary from years of civil war, became a hotbed of anxiety. Fear mingled with fascination as the public tried to imagine what was happening behind the Tower's closed gates. Even those closest to the royal family were caught between caution and curiosity. Courtiers carefully observed every messenger, every change in schedule, every new appointment Richard made. Small acts, a sudden guard rotation, the absence of familiar attendants were interpreted as ominous signals. Each rumor reinforced another, creating a climate of uncertainty that few could ignore. The rumors reached beyond London, traveling to the countryside through letters and returning travelers. Across England, nobles began choosing sides, gauging where their loyalty or caution would serve them best. The uncertainty surrounding the prince's fate became a tool for political maneuvering, with rumors shaping perceptions as much as actions did. By the time Edward V and his brother were seen again, if at all, the damage was done. The Tower had become not only a place of confinement, but a stage for fear.
Rumors had begun to rewrite reality, ensuring that the story of the princes would be remembered not just for their disappearance, but for the tension, suspicion, and intrigue that surrounded them from the very beginning. One of the most explosive developments in 1483 was the sudden question of Edward V's legitimacy. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, claimed that the late King Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, rendering their children illegitimate and unfit to inherit the throne. If true, this allegation would strip Edward V and his younger brother Richard of their royal status and justify Richard's assumption of power. The claim shocked the kingdom. Edward IV had ruled openly for years, and his children had been accepted as lawful heirs. The sudden challenge to their legitimacy seemed impossible to many, yet it provided Richard with a legal pretext to seize the crown. In an era where divine right and bloodlines governed authority, questions of birth were not merely personal, they were political weapons. Parliament was convened in what would later be called the Titulus Regius. Clergy and nobles debated Richard's case, and the young princes were declared illegitimate, barred from succession. Richard was crowned king shortly thereafter. While some historians argue that Richard sincerely believed the marriage invalid, others suggest that the claim was politically expedient, a tool to remove obstacles to the throne. For Edward V and his brother Richard, the declaration of illegitimacy had devastating consequences. No longer recognized as rightful heirs, they were effectively stripped of their authority while confined in the Tower. Their position shifted from potential rulers to vulnerable children whose claims could be denied or erased. The question of legitimacy transformed the political landscape of England overnight. It provided Richard with a veneer of legality while undermining the prince's claim. To the public, it blurred the lines between justice and ambition. What had once been a straightforward line of succession now became a battleground of power, law, and perception, one that would haunt the memory of the princes long after their disappearance. In challenging the boy's legitimacy, Richard not only seized the crown, but set the stage for one of history's greatest mysteries. The political landscape of England shifted dramatically with the enactment of the Titulus Regius, a parliamentary declaration that would legitimize Richard's claim to the throne and delegitimize Edward V. Passed in June 1483, the act declared that Edward IV's children were illegitimate, born of a marriage supposedly invalid under church law. This legal maneuver effectively barred the young princes from succession, clearing the way for Richard, Duke of Gloucester, to be crowned king. The act shocked contemporaries. To many, Edward V had been the lawful heir, his bloodline unquestioned until that moment. Yet the Titulus Regius framed the story differently, presenting Richard's ascension not as usurpation, but as adherence to the law and protection of the kingdom. By declaring the princes illegitimate, Parliament provided Richard with a veneer of legitimacy, giving him the authority to rule without immediate revolt. Historians debate the motivations behind the act. Some argue Richard genuinely believed the marriage of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, citing canon law and prior arrangements. Others see the act as a calculated political tool, exploiting legal technicalities to eliminate rivals. Whatever the intent, the outcome was the same. Edward V and his brother were stripped of their royal status, reduced to powerless children confined within the Tower. For the public, the Titulus Regius created confusion and suspicion. Citizens were unsure whether to accept Richard as king or to mourn a lost monarchy. The act marked a turning point, transforming the Tower from a place of protection into a prison, and the princes from heirs to pawns in a high-stakes power struggle. Ultimately, the Titulus Regius was more than a legal document.
It was a declaration of history in motion, one that reshaped the succession, silenced potential rivals, and set the stage for the enduring mystery of the prince's disappearance. In one parliamentary session, the line of succession was rewritten, and England's political future was forever altered.
On July 6, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III of England. The ceremony took place in Westminster Abbey, a site steeped in royal tradition, yet the air was charged with tension and uncertainty. The coronation, meant to symbolize stability and continuity, instead underscored the sudden and dramatic shift in England's political landscape. Richard entered the abbey with solemn dignity, wearing the crown that had been denied to his nephew, Edward V. He presented himself as the lawful ruler, claiming the protection of the kingdom and the upholding of law and order. Behind the pageantry, however, the coronation was fraught with unease. Many nobles and courtiers whispered doubts, uneasy about the legitimacy of his claim. The young princes, confined in the Tower and now legally declared illegitimate under the titulus regius, remained unseen and unheard. Their absence during the ceremony was a silent reminder of the stakes involved and the power Richard had consolidated. For Richard, taking the crown was both a triumph and a calculated risk. By asserting authority publicly, he aimed to stabilize the realm and assert control over England's fractious nobility. Yet in doing so, he also placed himself in the center of suspicion. Those loyal to Edward IV's children viewed the coronation with fear, wondering whether the new king would act against the boys to secure his throne. The public's reaction was mixed. Some accepted Richard's rule, persuaded by his legal claim and military reputation. Others feared the consequences, sensing that ambition and intrigue had overshadowed justice. London, always a hub of rumor, became a city alive with speculation. Richard's coronation marked a decisive turning point. By placing the crown upon his own head, he transformed from protector to sovereign, cementing his power and isolating Edward V and his brother further. History would forever remember this moment as the beginning of a reign shadowed by suspicion, controversy, and one of England's greatest mysteries, the fate of the princes in the Tower. After Richard III's coronation, the Tower of London fell into an unsettling quiet. The once bustling fortress, filled with the movement of courtiers, servants, and attendants, now seemed subdued. The two young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, remained behind its stone walls, isolated and unseen by the public. Their absence became a source of growing anxiety across England. This silence was not merely physical, it carried a weight of fear and speculation. Londoners noticed that the boy king had not been crowned and that the younger prince remained confined, yet no news emerged about their well-being. Courtiers and commoners alike began to whisper, questioning whether the princes were truly alive and whether Richard III had intentions that went beyond legal guardianship. The lack of information gave rise to doubt, creating a fertile ground for rumors that would haunt history. Inside the Tower, life for the boys was regimented and controlled. Guards watched their every move, and access was restricted to a small number of attendants loyal to Richard. Even simple routines, meals, play, or rest, occurred under scrutiny. While the princes may have experienced moments of normal childhood, the ever-present atmosphere of authority and confinement was inescapable. Outside, the public's imagination began to fill the void. Accounts circulated of whispered threats, sudden disappearances, and unexplained events within the Tower.
Londoners speculated endlessly, weaving a narrative of intrigue and danger. The silence itself became a tool, whether intentional or accidental, amplifying fear and uncertainty. By withdrawing from view, the princes became symbols of power, vulnerability, and mystery. Their voices unheard, their fate unknown, they existed more as objects of speculation than as active participants in the kingdom. The silence from the tower marked the beginning of their disappearance from history, a quiet prelude to one of England's most enduring mysteries. What truly happened to the young heirs of Edward IV? As the days passed following Richard III's coronation, unease rippled through London. The city, a hub of commerce, gossip, and political awareness, felt the tension of uncertainty surrounding the young princes. Edward V and his brother remained confined within the tower, unseen and unheard, while the new king occupied the throne. For many, this silence was alarming. Whispers of danger, conspiracy, and betrayal began to circulate through the streets and marketplaces, shaping public perception before any official word could be given. Londoners were acutely aware of the delicate balance of power. The Woodvilles, Edward's mother's family, had been sidelined, their influence curtailed by Richard's swift actions. Yet rumors persisted that factions loyal to them were plotting, or that they had already been neutralized. Merchants, artisans, and courtiers discussed the implications of a kingdom led by a king whose claim had been legally reinforced, yet morally questioned. People feared that the city, a center of political attention, could become a battleground should unrest erupt. Every movement of Richard III was scrutinized. Public appearances, proclamations, and military arrangements were interpreted as either reassurance or threat. The streets became alive with speculation. Was the young king safe? Were the princes truly imprisoned? Or had something more sinister occurred? News traveled slowly, and the absence of reliable information only fueled anxiety. In this climate of fear, loyalty became a fragile commodity. Nobles weighed allegiances carefully, cautious of offending the new king, while mindful of the public's growing distrust. London's unease reflected more than concern for the princes. It mirrored the city's understanding of power, ambition, and the fragility of authority. The tension gripping London foreshadowed the lasting uncertainty that would define Richard III's reign, and it set the stage for one of England's most enduring historical mysteries, the fate of the princes in the Tower. The central question that has haunted historians for centuries is simple, yet chilling. Did Richard III order the murder of his nephews, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury? Behind the tower's walls, the princes had vanished from public view, and the uncertainty surrounding their fate created fertile ground for speculation and accusation. While Richard's coronation had legitimized his rule, it could not erase the lingering suspicion that ambition had driven him to eliminate obstacles in the most absolute way. Supporters of the murder theory point to motive, means, and opportunity. As Lord Protector and now King, Richard stood to gain the throne by removing the boys. They were legitimate heirs, obstacles to his absolute authority. Inside the tower, a heavily guarded fortress, access was tightly controlled, providing the means for their disappearance without public knowledge. And with the coronation complete, the window of opportunity for a decisive, irreversible action had arrived. Yet some historians caution against immediate judgment. Richard had ruled the North effectively and had demonstrated loyalty to his brother Edward IV during the Wars of the Roses. There is little contemporary evidence of him ordering extrajudicial killings, and most accounts of the prince's deaths were written under Tudor rule decades later by authors with political motives to depict Richard as a villain. The truth remains elusive. Records from the tower during this period are sparse, and no definitive testimony confirms the fate of the boys. Modern archaeology has provided tantalizing clues, such as the discovery of unidentified skeletons under the tower staircase in 1674, but these findings cannot be conclusively linked to Edward V or his brother. Ultimately, whether Richard ordered murder may never be known. The question continues to captivate scholars, writers, and the public alike, a haunting reminder of ambition, power, and the fragility of innocence caught in the machinations of history. The mystery of the princes endures, unresolved, like a shadow cast across centuries. Motive is the lens through which Richard III's role in the prince's disappearance is most often examined. To understand why he might have acted against Edward V and his younger brother, one must consider the precarious world of late 15th century England, a kingdom shaped by war, ambition, and fragile loyalties. The throne was not simply inherited, it was contested, defended, and, at times, violently seized. As Lord Protector, Richard had been entrusted with guiding the young king and safeguarding the realm until Edward V could be crowned. Yet the same position placed him in proximity to the ultimate prize, the crown itself. A child king required guardianship, but he also represented a potential obstacle. For Richard, any action that strengthened his personal power or eliminated threats to it was a logical extension of political survival. The princes, heirs by birth, were the most immediate and powerful of those threats. Beyond personal ambition, Richard faced broader political pressures. England was still healing from the Wars of the Roses, and factions loyal to the Woodvilles, the prince's maternal family, had demonstrated their capacity for intrigue and influence. Their dominance over Edward V could have marginalized Richard, limiting his authority and potentially destabilizing the kingdom. Removing the princes would neutralize this risk entirely. Yet motive alone does not confirm action. Richard may have genuinely believed he was preserving the stability of the realm, framing his moves as necessary for the kingdom rather than self-interest. His reputation prior to the prince's disappearance was that of a capable and loyal administrator. Yet history would interpret the combination of ambition, opportunity, and potential threat in a far more sinister light. In the end, the motive remains clear. The princes represented both legitimacy and vulnerability, and for Richard, controlling or removing them was intertwined with the pursuit of power, security, and survival in a kingdom where hesitation could be fatal. Whether ambition outweighed conscience is the question that defines one of history's most enduring mysteries. Understanding whether Richard III could have harmed the princes requires examining his means, the tools, resources, and opportunities at his disposal. Unlike a distant or powerless figure, Richard was uniquely positioned to act decisively, surrounded by both authority and access that few others could claim. As Lord Protector, he controlled the Tower of London, the fortress where Edward V and his younger brother Richard were confined. The tower was not merely a prison, it was a heavily guarded complex with restricted access, patrolled by soldiers and overseen by officers loyal to the Protector. Inside its walls, movement could be monitored and regulated, leaving the princes isolated from anyone outside their immediate circle. Any action taken within the tower could be executed in secrecy, shielded from the public eye. Richard also commanded the loyalty of trusted allies and retainers. His northern support, earned through years of military service and governance, allowed him to deploy men for discreet operations. Orders issued by the Protector were followed without question, creating an environment where plans could be carried out swiftly and without interference. Even the Woodvilles,
once influential in Edward V's life, had been removed from proximity, eliminating obstacles to Richard's control. Moreover, the boys' youth made them especially vulnerable. They relied entirely on adults for food, shelter, and guidance. A child in medieval England had no ability to resist or escape within the tower, where doors were locked and guards watched constantly. The combination of restricted location, loyal enforcers, and the boys' dependents created a situation in which action could be taken with precision and secrecy. While motive and opportunity are debated, the means were unquestionably within Richard's grasp. He had access, authority, and control over both the environment and the people surrounding the princes. Whether he chose to use these means for protection or for darker purposes remains the central question of history, one that continues to fuel speculation about the fate of Edward V and his brother. Opportunity, alongside motive and means, is a crucial element in understanding the fate of Edward V and his younger brother Richard. Unlike other figures in England's turbulent court, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, possessed the rare combination of proximity, control, and timing that placed the princes entirely within his reach. The circumstances of 1483 created a narrow window in which decisive action could be taken, and Richard occupied it. From the moment Edward V and his entourage arrived at the tower, the boys were isolated. The Woodvilles, who had protected the king during his journey to London, were removed from the tower under arrest or barred from access. Guards loyal to Richard ensured that only authorized attendants could interact with the princes. Within the fortress, every corridor, staircase, and chamber was monitored. In medieval terms, the tower was the perfect environment to act without immediate risk of exposure. Timing was equally significant. Richard's coronation in early July cemented his authority, reducing the likelihood of immediate public backlash. The princes, legally declared illegitimate through the titulus regis, had no official claim to challenge his rule. Their isolation coincided with Richard consolidating power, neutralizing potential rivals, and ensuring his support among the nobility. In other words, opportunity aligned seamlessly with ambition. Moreover, medieval communication was slow and limited. Any action within the tower could remain secret for days or even weeks, allowing decisions to unfold without public scrutiny. The combination of physical confinement, loyal enforcers, and a controlled political environment created an almost absolute opportunity to act. While historians debate whether Richard used this opportunity for protection or elimination, the fact remains that the conditions were uniquely favorable. The princes were vulnerable, the protector was powerful, and the kingdom's focus rested elsewhere. History, however, only records the consequences, their disappearance, and leaves the true events of those critical weeks shrouded in uncertainty. One of the most influential sources regarding the fate of Edward V and his brother comes from Sir Thomas More, the famed 16th-century historian and statesman. Writing decades after the events, More's account is both detailed and dramatic, describing the disappearance of the princes in a way that has shaped popular perception for centuries. According to More, Richard III orchestrated the murder of his nephews within the Tower of London. He recounts how the boys were lured into a chamber, separated from their attendants, and ultimately killed to secure Richard's claim to the throne. The narrative paints a chilling picture, a child king betrayed by his own uncle, innocence destroyed by ambition, and a kingdom forced to accept a new monarch while mourning heirs lost to intrigue. More's account is particularly powerful because of its vivid details. He describes the boys as being confined, fearful, and isolated, emphasizing the cruelty of his uncle's actions.
These details created a compelling story that resonated with Tudor audiences who were eager to portray Richard as a villain in order to legitimize the reign of Henry VII. Over time, More's version became the foundation for many historical interpretations, as well as cultural depictions, including Shakespeare's Richard III. Yet, historians cautioned that More was writing nearly 50 years after the princes disappeared. His account relies on oral stories, hearsay, and Tudor propaganda. While compelling, it may not be strictly factual. The events could have been exaggerated to serve political ends. Nevertheless, More's narrative captures the fear, uncertainty, and moral outrage that surrounded the disappearance of the young kings, providing insight into how their story was remembered and interpreted. Even with its potential biases, Thomas More's account remains a cornerstone of the mystery, giving modern audiences a haunting window into the tower and a narrative that has defined the legend of the princes for centuries. It raises a question that still haunts history. Were these boys murdered, or did time and rumor simply turn absence into legend?
William Shakespeare's play Richard III, written in the late 16th century, immortalized the story of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury. Though dramatized for the stage, Shakespeare's depiction of the princes in the Tower has profoundly influenced how generations view Richard III and the mystery of their disappearance. In the play, Richard is portrayed as a cunning, ruthless villain, consumed by ambition and willing to commit any crime to claim the throne. Shakespeare dramatizes the murder of the princes, showing them as innocent victims trapped in the tower while their uncle plots their deaths. The boys are depicted as powerless, frightened, and entirely at the mercy of Richard, whose malevolence is amplified for theatrical effect. Through this portrayal, the princes become symbols of innocence destroyed by ambition, evoking both pity and outrage from the audience. Shakespeare's version emphasizes moral lessons as much as historical events. The play highlights the dangers of unchecked ambition, the vulnerability of the innocent, and the consequences of political machinations. By showing Richard orchestrating the deaths of the princes, Shakespeare constructs a narrative in which evil deeds inevitably lead to retribution, culminating in Richard's own downfall. This moral framing helped Tudor England legitimize the narrative of Richard as a tyrant, while solidifying Henry VII's claim to the throne. It is important to recognize that Shakespeare was not a historian. His work blends fact with fiction, drama, and propaganda. Many details in Richard III were influenced by Tudor accounts, particularly Sir Thomas More's narrative, and reflect the political needs of Elizabethan England rather than verified events. Nonetheless, the play cemented the image of Richard III as a villain and the princes as tragic victims. For centuries, Shakespeare's dramatization has shaped public perception, turning history into legend. The image of the two young boys trapped and silenced in the tower endures, haunting the imagination and keeping the mystery of their fate alive. The disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury did not occur in a vacuum. By the time the Tudor dynasty rose to power, nearly 3 decades after the princes vanished, their story had been shaped and reshaped to serve political ends. Tudor propaganda played a crucial role in defining Richard III as a villain and the princes as innocent victims, ensuring that public memory aligned with the legitimacy of Henry VIII's reign. Following his victory at Bosworth Field in 1485, Henry VIII faced the challenge of solidifying his rule over a kingdom still fractured by decades of civil war.
Linking Richard III to the murder of his nephews provided a moral justification for Henry's seizure of the throne. The narrative of Richard as a tyrant who murdered his nephews served not only to vilify his memory, but also to frame Henry as a savior who restored rightful governance. Chronicles, poems, and official records promoted this view, emphasizing Richard's ambition, cruelty, and alleged treachery. Tudor propaganda relied heavily on dramatic storytelling. Writers such as Sir Thomas More and Polydore Virgil portrayed the prince's disappearance as the ultimate proof of Richard's malevolence. The narrative underscored the innocence of the boys, highlighting their youth, helplessness, and legitimate claim to the throne. Public perception, shaped by sermons, plays, and commissioned histories, gradually accepted this portrayal as fact, cementing the legend of the princes in the Tower. While modern historians question the accuracy of these accounts, Tudor propaganda effectively defined the historical record for generations. By turning the disappearance into a moral and political tale, it created a lasting image of Richard III as a usurper and murderer. The princes, silenced in life, became eternal symbols of innocence betrayed, ensuring that the mystery surrounding their fate would endure and continue to captivate the world. While Richard III has long been accused of ordering the deaths of Edward V and his brother, some historians have suggested that Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, may have had a motive and opportunity to eliminate the princes. This theory arises from the fact that Henry, as a claimant to the throne, benefited directly from their disappearance. By removing the legitimate Yorkist heirs, he strengthened his own claim and reduced the risk of future rebellion once he ascended the throne. Henry Tudor had been in exile in Brittany and France during the crucial months of 1483. Though distant, he maintained a network of supporters within England and among continental allies, allowing him to exert influence through loyal agents. Some argue that once he secured the crown, after defeating Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485, the prince's continued existence would have posed a threat. In this view, the disappearance could have been delayed or orchestrated by Henry's supporters, rather than directly by Richard himself. Proponents of this theory point to Tudor propaganda as a complicating factor. By depicting Richard as a murderer of his nephews, Tudor writers diverted suspicion from Henry and framed him as the savior of England. The narrative painted the princes as victims of Richard's ambition, while Henry's involvement, if any, was obscured by time and political storytelling. However, evidence linking Henry to the prince's disappearance is circumstantial. There are no contemporary records suggesting his direct involvement during 1483, and he did not arrive in England until 2 years later. Yet the theory persists because it offers an alternative explanation for a mystery that has never been conclusively solved. The possibility that Henry Tudor or his allies could have played a role reminds us that history is rarely simple. Power, ambition, and secrecy intersected in ways that left the truth obscured. The prince's fate remains unknown, and the question of responsibility continues to intrigue historians, leaving multiple suspects in a centuries-old puzzle. One of the most intriguing figures in the events surrounding the princes in the Tower is Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. As Richard III's ally and one of the most powerful nobles in England, Buckingham played a pivotal role in the rise of Richard to the throne, and his involvement raises questions about his possible participation in the disappearance of Edward V and his brother. Buckingham had been a staunch Yorkist supporter and had fought alongside Richard in the battles that secured Yorkist dominance during the Wars of the Roses. When Edward IV died, Buckingham was instrumental in facilitating Richard's claim to the throne, helping to secure parliamentary support for the titulus regius and managing political negotiations that sidelined the Woodvilles. His loyalty and influence made him a key player in the transfer of power. Some historians suggest that Buckingham may have had a hand in the prince's fate, either acting on Richard's orders or pursuing his own interests. The boys were confined in the Tower under Richard's authority, but the Duke of Buckingham, as one of the king's most trusted nobles, had access to the fortress and the means to act. In a world where loyalty, ambition, and secrecy intersected, Buckingham's role cannot be overlooked. Later events complicate the picture further. In 1483, Buckingham rebelled against Richard III, citing grievances that included Richard's treatment of the nobility and the princes. His rebellion was swiftly crushed, and he was executed, leaving historians to speculate whether guilt over the prince's deaths influenced his defection, or whether political ambition alone drove his actions. Buckingham's involvement highlights the complexities of power in 15th century England. While Richard III is often the focus of suspicion, Buckingham's proximity, influence, and eventual rebellion make him a figure whose actions could have been decisive. Whether he acted as an agent, a conspirator, or simply a facilitator remains uncertain, leaving the mystery of the prince's fate unresolved. The mystery of the princes in the Tower took on a new dimension in 1674, nearly 2 centuries after their disappearance, when workmen renovating the Tower of London uncovered a small wooden box beneath a staircase. Inside were the skeletal remains of 2 children, seemingly undisturbed for generations. The discovery reignited centuries of speculation and offered a tantalizing, yet frustratingly incomplete clue to one of England's greatest historical enigmas. The bones were examined and later interred in Westminster Abbey, but forensic science at the time was rudimentary, providing little more than confirmation that the remains belonged to children. No definitive evidence could link the skeletons to Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury. Yet the find seemed to confirm long-held suspicions that the princes had met an untimely death within the Tower. The discovery reignited renewed public fascination and scholarly debate. Some historians viewed the bones as proof that Richard III or another political actor had murdered the boys. Others cautioned that the Tower had housed countless prisoners over the centuries, many of whom had died young, making any connection uncertain. The lack of documentation about burials under the staircase compounded the mystery. Modern attempts at scientific analysis have also faced limitations. DNA testing, though theoretically possible, has not conclusively identified the remains as the princes due to the absence of reliable reference material from confirmed relatives. Even if confirmed, the discovery would only prove death, not identify the responsible party. The mystery of the bones endures as a haunting symbol of lost innocence and unresolved history. They represent both hope and frustration for historians and the public alike, a physical reminder that the truth about Edward V and his brother may never be fully known. In the Tower, a site of power, imprisonment, and secrecy, these remains continued to evoke the enduring enigma of England's vanished princes. Even centuries after the disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, forensic science has struggled to provide definitive answers. The discovery of skeletal remains beneath the Tower of London in 1674 offered hope of solving the mystery, but limitations in both historical records and modern technology have kept the truth out of reach. The first challenge lies in identification. The remains were clearly those of children, but no contemporary records precisely documented burials within the tower. Over hundreds of years, the site had seen countless prisoners, accidental deaths, and natural fatalities. Without a reliable chain of custody or documentation, any connection to the princes remains speculative. Early examinations in the 17th century could only confirm age and approximate stature, leaving much to conjecture. Modern scientific techniques, including DNA analysis, have been proposed, but even these face obstacles. To positively identify the skeletons, researchers would need genetic material from confirmed relatives of Edward IV. While there are descendants from other branches of the Yorkist line, centuries of intermarriage and limited surviving samples complicate the process. Contamination over time further reduces the likelihood of obtaining conclusive results. Additionally, forensic science cannot reveal circumstances of death with absolute certainty in such old remains. Even if DNA confirmed identity, it would not explain when, how, or by whom the princes died. Trauma on bones may suggest violence, but it cannot distinguish between accidental injury, disease, or deliberate murder centuries later. These limitations underscore the enduring challenge of solving historical mysteries. The tower's walls may conceal the truth forever, and the skeletal remains, while compelling, may only offer partial clues. For historians and forensic experts alike, the case of the princes highlights the intersection of science, history, and legend, and the sobering reality that some answers may remain beyond reach.
Understanding Richard III's character is central to interpreting the mystery of the princes in the tower. Was he a ruthless murderer, a loyal protector, or a pragmatic ruler navigating a dangerous political landscape? History provides conflicting images, shaped by contemporary accounts, Tudor propaganda, and later literary interpretations. Richard was a skilled military leader and administrator. He governed the north of England effectively, earning respect from both nobles and commoners. His campaigns during the Wars of the Roses demonstrated loyalty to his brother Edward IV, as well as strategic intelligence and decisiveness. These qualities suggest a man capable of governance and leadership, not merely the caricature of a villain painted by later historians. Yet Richard's rise to power after Edward IV's death raises questions. As Lord Protector, he acted quickly to consolidate control, sidelining the Woodvilles and isolating the young king. His swift moves demonstrate political acumen, but they also create the appearance of ambition unchecked by scruple. Whether he acted out of genuine concern for the kingdom or personal gain remains debated. Literary and historical sources complicate his image further. Tudor writers, including Sir Thomas More and Polydore Virgil, portrayed Richard as a physically deformed tyrant who murdered his nephews to claim the throne. Shakespeare's dramatization in Richard III amplified this portrayal, shaping public perception for centuries. While compelling, these accounts are heavily influenced by politics, bias, and the desire to legitimize the Tudor succession. Modern historians attempt a more nuanced view. Richard may have been a shrewd, capable ruler facing extraordinary challenges, whose decisions, whether right or wrong, were shaped by the precariousness of his time. His character is a blend of loyalty, pragmatism, and ambition, and the debate over his morality continues to fuel the mystery of the princes. Understanding Richard as a complex figure allows us to consider the possibilities without reducing history to legend, leaving his true intentions, like the fate of Edward V and his brother, uncertain. Despite the darkness surrounding the tower and the disappearance of the princes, some historical accounts suggest that Richard III may have shown acts of mercy during his reign. These moments, though overshadowed by accusations of cruelty, provide insight into a more complex figure and offer a counterpoint to the narrative that portrays him solely as a tyrant. Richard's governance in the north of England
demonstrates an ability to act decisively yet fairly. He was known for implementing efficient justice, protecting the rights of commoners, and curbing corruption among officials. Unlike other rulers of his time, Richard sought to enforce the law impartially, ensuring that even those without wealth or status could find redress. These actions suggest a ruler concerned with justice and order, rather than unmitigated cruelty. Moreover, Richard occasionally extended protection to rivals or potential enemies when it suited the stability of the realm. Records indicate that some nobles who had opposed him in previous conflicts were pardoned, allowed to retain their lands, or reintegrated into court life. Such acts of clemency indicate political pragmatism and a willingness to balance firmness with leniency, reinforcing his image as a calculated ruler rather than a reckless tyrant. Even in the context of the prince's disappearance, some historians argue that Richard may have initially intended to protect Edward V, keeping him in the Tower to prevent the Woodvilles from exerting undue influence. While this theory remains speculative, it frames his actions as possibly motivated by concern for the kingdom's stability rather than pure malice. These acts of mercy complicate the story of Richard III. They remind us that historical figures often operate in shades of gray, and that ambition and ruthlessness can coexist with fairness and compassion. In considering these deeds, we are encouraged to see Richard not only as a suspect in one of England's greatest mysteries, but also as a ruler capable of measured, merciful decisions. Richard III's reign, though brief, was marked by significant unrest and rebellion. Even after consolidating power and securing the throne through the Titulus Regius, discontent simmered among nobles, Yorkist loyalists, and those suspicious of his rise. These rebellions provide critical context for understanding both Richard's rule and the atmosphere surrounding the mysterious fate of Edward V and his brother. One of the earliest challenges came from the Duke of Buckingham, initially Richard's ally. Buckingham had been instrumental in facilitating Richard's claim, helping neutralize the Woodvilles and gain parliamentary approval. Yet by October 1483, Buckingham rebelled, citing grievances over Richard's treatment of the nobility and allegedly seeking to place Henry Tudor on the throne. His rebellion was swiftly crushed and he was executed. The revolt exposed cracks in Richard's support and heightened tensions across the kingdom. Other uprisings, though smaller, reflected ongoing dissatisfaction. Regional Yorkist factions, loyal to Edward IV's lineage, remained wary of Richard's intentions. Even minor revolts drew attention to the unresolved question of the prince's fate, fueling speculation and undermining confidence in the new king. Public perception increasingly associated Richard with the disappearance of the heirs, whether justified or not. These rebellions forced Richard to act decisively, often with severity, to maintain authority. He relied on loyal forces, punitive measures, and careful political maneuvering to suppress dissent. Each revolt reinforced the precariousness of his position and the need to secure the loyalty of influential nobles, further isolating the Tower and the princes from any potential rescuers. The pattern of rebellion illustrates the unstable political climate of England in 1483. Richard's actions, whether protective or ambitious, occurred within a kingdom rife with factionalism and suspicion. These uprisings underscore the pressure he faced, providing context for the choices and strategies that defined his controversial reign and the enduring mystery of the princes in the Tower. Richard III's reign lasted only 2 years, from July 1483 to August 1485, yet it was filled with controversy, political maneuvering,
and unresolved mysteries. His brief time on the throne has been scrutinized endlessly, primarily because it was intertwined with the disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother, the princes in the Tower. The brevity of his rule amplified every action, rumor, and decision, making each event seem monumental in the eyes of contemporaries and later historians. From the beginning, Richard faced enormous pressure. Although crowned king with the titulus regius legitimizing his claim, many questioned the morality of declaring Edward V illegitimate. Nobles who had supported Edward IV were uncertain where their loyalties should lie, and the Woodvilles, though sidelined, still represented a powerful faction. Richard's every move, his consolidation of power, the removal of potential rivals, and the management of dissent were scrutinized and often interpreted through a lens of suspicion. During his short reign, Richard implemented measures to strengthen the monarchy. He sought to reduce corruption, enforce justice impartially, and stabilize the north of England, where he had long been a respected figure. Yet these positive actions were overshadowed by the unresolved question of the prince's fate. Public perception increasingly linked him to their disappearance, whether fairly or not, creating a lasting stain on his legacy. Richard's reign ended abruptly at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 1485, where he was defeated by Henry Tudor. His sudden death brought an end to Yorkist rule and allowed the Tudors to shape the narrative of his kingship, emphasizing alleged cruelty and ambition while downplaying his achievements. In retrospect, Richard's short reign was a turbulent period defined by power, suspicion, and unresolved tragedy. The disappearance of the princes, coupled with political unrest, ensured that his legacy would remain controversial, leaving historians to debate his intentions and the true story of Edward V and his brother. The Battle of Bosworth Field, fought on August 22, 1485, was the decisive clash that ended Richard III's reign and brought the Wars of the Roses to a close. It was not only a military confrontation, but also a dramatic turning point in the mystery surrounding the princes in the Tower. While the boys' fate remained unresolved, the battle reshaped the political landscape, determining who would control England and how history would remember Richard. Richard III faced Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant with a tenuous but politically significant claim to the throne. The two armies met on a misty field in Leicestershire, and the stakes could not have been higher. Richard, known for his courage and battlefield leadership, personally led charges in an attempt to break Henry's lines. Contemporary accounts describe him fighting with ferocity and desperation, fully aware that his survival and the stability of his reign depended on victory. Yet loyalty among Richard's own nobles faltered. Some key allies hesitated or defected during the battle, weakening his forces and contributing to his ultimate defeat. Surrounded and outnumbered, Richard fell in combat, killed on the battlefield. His death marked the end of Yorkist rule and cleared the path for Henry Tudor to claim the crown as Henry VII. For the mystery of the princes, the Battle of Bosworth was a turning point in a different sense. With Richard gone, responsibility and suspicion regarding the boys' disappearance shifted entirely to history. Henry Tudor and his supporters used the battle to legitimize their rule, framing Richard as a tyrant whose alleged crimes, including the fate of Edward V and his brother, justified his overthrow. The Battle of Bosworth Field was more than a military victory. It was the moment when power, ambition, and rumor converged. Richard's defeat ended his short, turbulent reign,
leaving unanswered questions about the princes in the Tower and cementing their disappearance as one of England's most enduring historical mysteries. With Richard III's death at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 1485, Henry Tudor ascended to the throne as Henry VII, marking the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. His rise to power was swift, but fraught with the challenges of securing legitimacy in a kingdom long torn by civil war. The disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother cast a long shadow over his accession, as rumors and suspicions about their fate were intertwined with questions of succession and loyalty. Henry VII's first priority was to consolidate power. He married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, uniting the warring Yorkist and Lancastrian factions. This political marriage symbolized reconciliation and strengthened his claim to the throne, blending bloodlines and legitimizing his rule in the eyes of the nobility and the public. It was a calculated act designed to stabilize England and diminish potential Yorkist challenges, including lingering concerns about the princes in the Tower. The young heir's absence, however, remained a sensitive issue. Henry's reign was influenced by the need to address or suppress speculation surrounding Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury. Tudor propaganda framed Richard III as a villain responsible for their deaths, portraying Henry as a rightful and just ruler who had restored order to the kingdom. By emphasizing Richard's alleged crimes and the danger posed by Yorkist heirs, Henry reinforced the legitimacy of his new dynasty, while deflecting attention from the unresolved mystery of the princes in the Tower. Henry VII's accession marked a turning point in English history. The monarchy transitioned from the Yorkist to the Tudor line, but the shadow of the vanished princes lingered. Their fate became a cautionary tale used to justify Tudor authority and discredit predecessors. In securing power, Henry VII cemented the narrative that the Tower's young princes were victims of ambition and treachery, a narrative that would shape public perception for centuries and ensure the mystery of their disappearance remained an enduring element of England's royal history. After Richard III's death and Henry VII's ascent to the throne, the silence surrounding Edward V and his younger brother persisted. The Tower of London, once a place of confinement for the young princes, had long since closed its gates to them, but no definitive word of their fate ever emerged. Their disappearance became one of history's most haunting, unresolved mysteries, and the silence itself became a powerful symbol of loss, uncertainty, and political intrigue. During Henry VII's reign, questions about the prince's whereabouts were politically inconvenient. The new king relied on the narrative of Richard III as a tyrant to legitimize his rule, and acknowledging any possibility that the boys might have survived, or implicating anyone else, threatened that story. Chroniclers and propagandists emphasized Richard's alleged cruelty while maintaining the mystery, ensuring that the silence remained unbroken and the prince's fate unspoken. For the public, the absence of information fueled speculation. Rumors of murder, secret imprisonment, or escape circulated in whispers and tales, making the princes figures of fascination and fear. The Tower, silent and imposing, became a focal point for imagination, a place where innocence had vanished and history had left a gap that could never be fully filled. Even within the royal court, the silence persisted. Nobles and courtiers knew the boys were gone, yet no one could speak openly about the details without risking political consequences. This enforced quiet ensured that the mystery endured, leaving historians and storytellers to piece together events from fragmented records, hearsay, and later accounts. The silence after 1485 transformed the princes into symbols rather than historical actors. Their lives, confined within the tower, became a story told in absence and uncertainty. The lack of answers, the unanswered questions, and the lingering fear of what had occurred solidified their place in history as the princes in the tower, forever trapped in a story that is still told, pondered, and debated centuries later. One of the most puzzling aspects of the prince's disappearance is the lack of any formal investigation at the time. Despite the high-profile nature of Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, no inquiry was launched to determine their fate. Several factors combined to create an environment in which silence prevailed and suspicion went largely unexamined. First, political considerations made an investigation risky. Edward III had been crowned king, and his authority was reinforced by the titulus regis, which declared the boys illegitimate. Questioning the young king's uncle could have destabilized the realm or sparked civil unrest, particularly given the volatile aftermath of Edward IV's death. Nobles and officials may have feared retaliation, loss of favor, or involvement in a dangerous power struggle, discouraging any action that might challenge Richard's authority. Second, the Tudor dynasty, which succeeded Richard, had little incentive to investigate. Henry VII relied on the narrative that Richard had murdered the princes to justify his claim to the throne. A formal inquiry could have raised uncomfortable questions, potentially implicating allies or exposing alternate theories about the prince's fate. By allowing the mystery to persist, Tudor propagandists could cement Richard's image as a villain and strengthen the legitimacy of the new dynasty. Third, historical records and communication were limited. The tower was tightly controlled, and those who might have known details were either silenced, removed, or lacked the ability to report information reliably. The secrecy surrounding the prince's confinement made it nearly impossible for contemporaries to gather evidence or verify claims. Ultimately, the absence of investigation left a void that has persisted for centuries. Without contemporary scrutiny, the fate of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury remains a historical enigma. The lack of accountability, combined with political expediency and secrecy, ensured that the mystery endured, leaving future generations to speculate, debate, and imagine what truly happened to England's lost princes. The mystery of the princes in the tower has led some historians and enthusiasts to speculate, could Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury have escaped? While the prevailing theory suggests they were murdered, the possibility of survival adds an intriguing, if unlikely, dimension to their story. The boys were heavily guarded within the Tower of London, a fortress designed to prevent escape. Soldiers loyal to Richard III controlled access, and only a few attendants were allowed near the young princes. Medieval fortresses were not easily breached, and the tower's defenses included high walls, gates, and strategically placed watchmen. For two children to escape undetected would have required significant outside assistance or extraordinary luck. Supporters of the escape theory point to reports of impostors later claiming to be the lost princes. One notable case is Perkin Warbeck, who appeared during Henry VII's reign and claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury. Although most historians dismiss Warbeck as an impostor, his story suggests that rumors of survival persisted, keeping hope alive for Yorkist royalists and fueling public imagination. Some also speculate that loyalists or sympathetic guards could have orchestrated a secret removal from the tower, perhaps smuggling the boys abroad to safety. However, evidence for such an elaborate plan is lacking, and the political climate at the time made concealment extremely difficult. Any attempt to hide the heirs would have required complicity from multiple high-ranking officials, increasing the risk of exposure. While the escape theory is appealing to the imagination, practical considerations make it unlikely. The tower's security, the political stakes, and the absence of verifiable evidence suggest that escape was improbable. Yet the very possibility has endured in folklore, literature, and historical debate, keeping alive the enduring question of whether the princes might have survived, or whether their disappearance remains an unsolved tragedy of medieval England. The mystery of the princes in the tower gave rise to several pretenders, individuals who claimed to be Edward V or his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury. These figures emerged decades after the prince's disappearance, exploiting public fascination and political unrest. Among them, the most famous was Perkin Warbeck, whose story captivated England and Europe alike. Perkin Warbeck first appeared in 1490, claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the two princes. He maintained that he had survived the tower and had been hidden away by loyalists to protect him from Richard III's alleged plots. Warbeck gained the backing of powerful foreign monarchs, including Margaret of Burgundy, Charles VIII of France, and James IV of Scotland, all of whom saw in him a means to destabilize Henry VII's reign. The boyish figure of Warbeck, coupled with his confidence in asserting royal identity, created enough uncertainty to spark real political threats. Before Warbeck, there were whispers of other claimants, though less organized and less widely recognized. These pretenders fueled nostalgia among Yorkist supporters, keeping alive the idea that the rightful heirs to the throne might still exist. Their emergence also illustrates how the unresolved fate of the princes created a vacuum in English politics, one that opportunists and foreign powers could exploit. Henry VII responded decisively. Warbeck's movements were closely monitored, rebellions supporting him were suppressed, and ultimately he was captured, paraded, and executed in 1499. Henry's handling of the pretender emphasized the importance of controlling narrative and legitimacy. By eliminating claimants, he reinforced his own authority and quelled public speculation. The pretenders, however, serve as a reminder of the prince's enduring legacy. Though long gone, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury continued to influence politics, inspire hope, and provoke fear. Their story, unresolved and mysterious, created opportunities for impostors to step into history's shadow, demonstrating the lasting impact of their disappearance on England's royal succession.
During Richard III's brief reign, fear became one of the most powerful tools in maintaining control over a kingdom still fractured by civil war. The disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother in the Tower of London created a climate of uncertainty that permeated both the court and the public. Whether deliberate or accidental, the atmosphere of fear served as a weapon, reinforcing Richard's authority while suppressing dissent. The tower itself became a symbol of this fear. Its walls, corridors, and gates held not only the princes, but also the perception of absolute power. Courtiers, nobles, and commoners alike recognized that no one was entirely safe from the consequences of disloyalty or misstep. The uncertainty surrounding the prince's fate amplified the sense of danger. The young heirs had vanished, yet no official explanation was offered. This ambiguity allowed rumor, suspicion, and imagination to flourish, reinforcing Richard's position by demonstrating that even royal blood could be vulnerable under his watch. Fear also operated strategically within the court. Nobles who might have challenged Richard's authority or sought to support the princes were deterred by the potential consequences. The disappearance acted as a silent warning. Ambition could be punished, loyalty could be tested, and secrecy was enforced. This environment encouraged compliance, making it difficult for opposition to organize and strengthening Richard's grip on power. Public perception was equally influenced. Londoners and subjects across the kingdom speculated endlessly about the prince's fate, their imaginations filling the silence with horror. The mystery itself became a tool, controlling discourse and limiting open criticism of the king. By wielding fear through mystery, isolation, and the threat of unseen consequences, Richard III demonstrated a calculated understanding of power. The disappearance of Edward V and his brother was not merely a personal tragedy, it became a mechanism of control, shaping loyalty, obedience, and the very psychology of a kingdom still recovering from decades of conflict.
The fate of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, continues to spark debate among modern historians. Centuries of speculation, biased sources, and limited contemporary records make it one of England's most enduring historical mysteries. While traditional narratives blame Richard III for their disappearance, recent scholarship emphasizes nuance, questioning long-held assumptions, and examining the evidence with a critical eye. Historians analyzing contemporary records note that direct evidence implicating Richard III is scarce. Most accounts describing the prince's deaths were written years later under Tudor rule, often influenced by political agendas to vilify Richard and legitimize Henry VII's reign. Sir Thomas More's writings, for example, portray the young kings as innocent victims, but More wrote decades after the events and relied on second-hand reports. This has led scholars to treat such sources with caution, acknowledging their narrative power but questioning their reliability. Some historians consider alternative theories, suggesting that other figures, such as Henry VII, loyal Yorkist nobles, or even opportunistic members of Richard's court, could have played a role in the prince's disappearance. The lack of records from within the tower during the crucial months of 1483 leaves open the possibility that the princes might have survived longer than traditionally assumed, or that the circumstances of their deaths were more complex than Tudor accounts suggest. Modern historical debate also explores Richard III's character and political environment. Some scholars argue he was a capable, pragmatic ruler, navigating a dangerous period, while others accept the likelihood of foul play to secure his throne. Archaeological discoveries, such as the skeletal remains found under the tower in 1674, add intrigue, but cannot provide conclusive answers. Ultimately, historians today recognize that certainty may never be possible. The prince's disappearance remains an unresolved question, shaped by incomplete evidence, political bias, and centuries of legend. Modern scholarship emphasizes context, critical analysis, and the enduring importance of the mystery, reminding us that history often resists simple explanations. Evidence implicating Richard III in the disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, is largely circumstantial, yet it has convinced many historians and contemporaries of his potential guilt. The combination of motive, means, and opportunity forms the core of the argument against him, even if no direct documentation confirms the crime. Motive was clear. The boys were the legitimate heirs to the throne. As Lord Protector, Richard initially governed on Edward V's behalf, but the existence of the princes posed a constant threat to his claim. Once he assumed the crown through the titulus regius, their presence became politically inconvenient. Eliminating them would secure his position, remove Yorkist rivals, and prevent any future challenge to his authority. Means and opportunity were equally evident. The princes were confined within the Tower of London, a fortress under Richard's control. Access was tightly regulated, and only those loyal to him could interact with the boys. Medieval records and accounts emphasized that the tower was designed to prevent escape and ensure isolation,
giving Richard the perfect environment to act without interference. Contemporary and near-contemporary chroniclers, including Sir Thomas More and later Tudor historians, describe the prince's disappearance in ways that implicate Richard. They emphasize his ambition, the sudden removal of the Woodvilles, and the secrecy surrounding the prince's confinement. Although these accounts were influenced by Tudor political motives, they reflect persistent suspicion that Richard was responsible. Additional circumstantial evidence includes Richard's quick consolidation of power and his treatment of potential rivals. The Duke of Buckingham's later rebellion, coupled with widespread rumors of the prince's fate, suggests a climate in which violent action against heirs was plausible. While absolute proof remains elusive, the convergence of motive, means, opportunity, and historical suspicion forms a compelling case against Richard III, leaving his potential involvement as the central explanation for one of England's most enduring royal mysteries. While Richard III is often accused of murdering Edward V and his younger brother, some historians argue that evidence exists to defend his reputation and question his guilt. The debate centers on the reliability of sources, the political context, and the lack of definitive proof connecting Richard directly to the prince's disappearance. First, contemporary accounts of Richard's actions are sparse and often ambiguous. Many detailed narratives, such as those by Sir Thomas More and Polydore Virgil, were written decades after the events during the Tudor reign. These writers had political motives to portray Richard as a villain, ensuring that Henry VII's legitimacy was reinforced. The absence of first-hand reports implicating Richard suggests caution before accepting the murder narrative as fact. Second, Richard had reason to protect the princes, at least initially. As Lord Protector, he governed on Edward V's behalf, overseeing both the realm and the young king's safety. Some historians argue that his placement of the boys in the Tower was intended to shield them from potentially hostile factions, particularly the Woodvilles, whose influence could have endangered Edward V or destabilized the kingdom. Additionally, Richard faced considerable political pressure and instability. Rapidly consolidating power after Edward IV's death required careful navigation of Yorkist and Lancastrian factions. A sudden act of regicide might have risked rebellion or loss of support from northern allies who had been loyal to Richard. The fact that the prince's disappearance occurred during such a tense and complex period suggests that multiple parties, rather than Richard alone, could have been responsible. Finally, there is no direct evidence, no document, confession, or reliable witness linking Richard to the boys' deaths. While motive, means, and opportunity existed, the historical record is silent on the act itself. In sum, the evidence defending Richard emphasizes uncertainty, context, and the political motivations of later sources. The possibility remains that he was not the murderer, leaving the fate of Edward V and his brother an unresolved mystery in English history.
Despite centuries of speculation, rumors, and historical debate, very little about the fate of Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury can be stated with absolute certainty. Historians must distinguish between evidence, conjecture, and later interpretations, acknowledging what is factually known versus what remains in the realm of mystery. First, it is certain that the boys were placed in the Tower of London in the spring of 1483. Edward V had arrived in London for his coronation, accompanied by his entourage, and his younger brother joined him shortly thereafter. The Tower served both as a royal residence and a fortress, providing security during the transition of power. Their presence there is well documented in contemporary records. Second, we know that Edward V was declared illegitimate by the Titulus Regius, which allowed Richard III to claim the throne.
This political maneuver effectively removed the boys from immediate succession, a fact confirmed by parliamentary acts and legal documents. The declaration changed the course of English history, setting the stage for Richard's coronation in July 1483. Third, it is certain that the princes disappeared from public view after being confined in the Tower. No reliable records or eyewitness accounts indicate what happened to them, and they never appeared again in court or public life. This disappearance is widely accepted as fact and is the central mystery of the Tower's history. What remains uncertain is their ultimate fate, whether they were murdered, died of natural causes, or were secretly removed. No contemporary evidence exists to confirm any specific outcome, and all later accounts are influenced by political bias, rumor, or propaganda. In summary, what we can state for certain is limited. The boys were in the Tower, Edward V was declared illegitimate, and both vanished from history. Beyond these points, their fate remains unknown, leaving one of England's most enduring historical mysteries unresolved to this day.
The fate of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, ultimately belongs to the realm of the unknowable. Despite centuries of research, speculation, and dramatization, certain aspects of their story may never be uncovered. The passage of time, the lack of contemporary records, and deliberate secrecy surrounding the Tower of London have left gaps in history that are likely impossible to fill. We will never know the precise circumstances of the prince's disappearance. Whether they were murdered, hidden, or died by accident remains unrecorded. The Tower was a tightly controlled environment, and no accounts survive from within the walls that could definitively explain their fate. Every narrative, whether from Sir Thomas More, Tudor chroniclers, or later historians, carries bias, political motivation, or hearsay, leaving the truth obscured by interpretation rather than confirmed by fact. We will never know the full extent of Richard III's intentions. Motive, means, and opportunity suggest he could have acted against the boys, but the historical record does not confirm his guilt. Likewise, the possibility that other figures, rival nobles, foreign powers, or even loyalists played a role remains speculative. The absence of evidence leaves multiple scenarios plausible, each compelling yet ultimately unverifiable. We will never fully grasp the personal experiences of the princes themselves. Their thoughts, fears, and feelings are lost to history. The boys have become symbols rather than historical actors, their humanity overshadowed by the legend that grew around them. In the end, the story of the princes in the Tower is defined as much by what we will never know as by what we do. The mystery endures because history has left deliberate silences, lost records, and unanswered questions. Their disappearance remains a shadow in England's past, a haunting enigma that reminds us of the limits of historical knowledge and the enduring power of human curiosity. Although Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury vanished centuries ago, their legacy has endured in both history and popular imagination. The mystery surrounding the princes in the Tower has transcended their brief lives, leaving an indelible mark on English culture, politics, and the collective memory of the nation. Their disappearance symbolizes the fragility of innocence in a world dominated by power, ambition, and intrigue. The boys became enduring figures of tragedy, children caught in the ruthless struggle for the throne. Their story has inspired countless works of literature, art, and theater, from Sir Thomas More's early accounts to Shakespeare's dramatization in Richard III. These retellings immortalize them as emblems of lost innocence, ensuring that their names remain synonymous with betrayal and mystery. Politically,
the prince's disappearance shaped the course of English monarchy. Their absence removed Yorkist heirs who could have challenged Henry VII, allowing the Tudor dynasty to consolidate power and craft a narrative that vilified Richard III. Over time, this legacy influenced how English rulers approached succession, the safeguarding of heirs, and the management of political rivals. The events in the Tower set a precedent for the intertwining of personal tragedy and national politics, demonstrating how the fates of individuals could alter the course of a kingdom. The princes also left a legacy in historical inquiry. Their story challenges historians to distinguish between fact and legend, evaluate biased sources, and consider the complex interplay of power, rumor, and human ambition. Debates over Richard III's guilt, the possibility of survival, and the involvement of other actors have kept scholars engaged for centuries. Ultimately, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury endure not only as historical figures, but as symbols. Their lives and mysterious disappearance remind us of the enduring human fascination with lost innocence, unresolved questions, and the profound consequences of power unchecked by morality. Their legacy is one of mystery, memory, and the haunting presence of history's unanswered questions. Richard III's reputation has been shaped as much by history and legend as by documented fact. For centuries, he has been remembered as the archetypal villain, the usurper, the murderer of the princes in the Tower, and a tyrant whose ambition overshadowed any virtue. Yet a closer examination of historical context, contemporary sources, and modern scholarship reveals a far more complex figure. Much of Richard's negative reputation stems from Tudor-era accounts, written decades after his death. Historians like Sir Thomas More and Polydore Virgil portrayed him as a deformed, cruel, and power-hungry ruler. Shakespeare's Richard III amplified this portrayal, transforming the historical king into a dramatic villain whose actions were defined by malice and ambition. These sources, influenced by the political need to legitimate Henry VII's claim, cast Richard as the murderer of his nephews, ensuring that public memory aligned with the Tudor narrative. However, modern historians have re-examined Richard's life and reign with greater nuance. Evidence shows he was an effective administrator and military leader, particularly in the north of England, where he maintained order and upheld justice. His political decisions, including the removal of the princes from court, can be interpreted as pragmatic moves in a turbulent period, rather than purely malicious acts. Richard's reputation also reflects the enduring power of rumor and myth. The mystery of the princes in the Tower has ensured that his legacy is inseparable from suspicion and speculation. Even without definitive proof, centuries of storytelling have cemented an image of a villain, overshadowing potential acts of fairness, loyalty, and capable governance. In the end, Richard III's reputation is a study in contrasts, a king vilified in popular culture, yet viewed by some modern scholars as a capable, complex, and perhaps misunderstood ruler. The mystery of the princes in the Tower continues to define him, ensuring that history remembers both his achievements and the shadow of suspicion that surrounds his name. The disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, remains one of England's most enduring historical mysteries. More than 5 centuries have passed, yet no definitive evidence has ever emerged to explain what happened to the young princes. Their fate continues to intrigue historians, scholars, and the public alike, symbolizing the enduring allure of unsolved history. The mystery persists because the historical record is frustratingly incomplete. Contemporary accounts are scarce, and those that exist, such as Sir Thomas More's writings, were created decades after the events, often influenced by political agendas.
Tudor propagandists shaped narratives that painted Richard III as a ruthless murderer, a portrayal designed to legitimize Henry VII's claim to the throne. These sources, while compelling, leave uncertainty about what truly occurred in the Tower of London. The lack of physical evidence further deepens the enigma. The discovery of two children's skeletons beneath the tower in 1674 offered hope of resolution, yet without reliable DNA comparison to confirm their identities, the remains cannot definitively answer the question. Over time, legends, imposters, and dramatizations have filled in gaps with speculation, adding layers of intrigue but complicating the historical record. The enduring mystery also reflects broader themes of power, ambition, and vulnerability. The prince's disappearance illustrates how political struggle and personal ambition can erase innocence, leaving questions that echo through history. The tower itself, once a fortress and royal residence, has become a symbol of secrecy, danger, and unanswered questions. Ultimately, the story of the princes in the tower endures because it combines tragedy, political intrigue, and the limits of historical knowledge. Their fate may never be conclusively known, but the mystery continues to captivate, reminding us that history is often defined as much by what is unknown as by what is documented. Their story is a haunting testament to the unresolved questions that linger at the heart of England's past. The story of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, the princes in the Tower, remains one of England's most haunting mysteries. Despite centuries of study, speculation, and debate, the truth of what happened to these young heirs has never been conclusively revealed. Their disappearance symbolizes the intersection of innocence, ambition, and political power, leaving a shadow over the late 15th century English monarchy. Throughout history, the princes have captured imaginations as victims of intrigue. Theories about their fate range from murder by Richard III to elimination by other political actors, to even the possibility of secret survival. Yet no contemporary evidence provides certainty. The Tower of London, once a royal residence and fortress, remains emblematic of the secrecy and danger that surrounded the young kings. Every account, from Tudor chroniclers to Shakespearean drama, adds to their story, but also complicates it, blending history with legend. The disappearance of the princes reminds us that history is often incomplete. The absence of definitive proof invites us to question sources, consider motives, and understand the complex world of medieval politics. Their story continues to spark debate among historians, writers, and enthusiasts, reflecting the enduring fascination with royal intrigue, ambition, and mystery. Even as the centuries pass, the princes in the tower remain symbols of lost innocence, unresolved questions, and the human desire to understand the past. Their legacy endures not only in history books, but also in art, literature, and popular imagination, reminding us that some mysteries never fade. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. By doing so, you help keep history alive, support more deep dives into the past, and ensure that stories like The Princes in the Tower continue to reach those who love mystery and history alike.